Hey nerds, what's up? Thank you guys for all of your very thoughtful comments on my video about whether or not we can definitively say works in fantasy are good or bad. You guys had so much good stuff to say that I want to go over your comments today and kind of continue the discussion. If you haven't seen my first video, you can watch it here and you'll probably need to watch it before this discussion. So let's get into it. See you after the jump. Okay, so the first thing a lot of people brought up was the concept of time. You know, that time can really tell us when something is skilled or unskilled. And I'm gonna read this comment by Von Roycroft. I think he says it really well. He says, along those lines, I've been thinking about what stands the test of time. I've been watching a series called 1971, the year that music changed everything. And wow, so many classic songs and albums came out that year. So many artists either rose to prominence or produced seminal works in that same year. It'll probably never happen again, and those songs, albums, artists are, in my opinion, unquestionably skilled, and they hit such a critical moment in cultural history. Are both those things part of why these songs continue to resonate for this old guy? I would say they resonate for all of us, personally. And he said, you know, there's a correlation between the music. Are some classics simply less evident of their time? Will we still be talking about reading and recommending Abercrombie and Sanderson when they've been around as long as Tolkien? In my book, The Test of Time is actually a test that might be a consideration that removes a bit of the subjectivity you're discussing here. Okay, so I loved everything about this comment. I do think music is a great comparison. The only thing that I think is interesting between the music and the book discussion is that with music, there is a lot of charisma that I think needs to blend with skill, whereas authors are less present in their works, but maybe it's the works themselves that need charisma. I don't know. That's kind of an interesting point. But going back to time, yes, I think time is a huge factor. I think things that stand that test, like Tolkien, they had to be something there. There had to be something there that they're still resonating with audiences decades and decades later. Is it the skill of these works, or is it because they were able to hit to the heart of human nature that doesn't change no matter how much our technology or world changes? I don't know. Now, the one problem with time is that it does create this barrier on skilled versus unskilled for new authors. In fact, that means anyone, I would say, in the last 20 years producing content, we couldn't claim as skilled. So I think time could be a factor introduced with the other two I mentioned, like the value skills and the court of public opinion, but I feel like it can't be the only one, because I think we can understand that some people are skilled here. I do think time is what gives us our legends in fantasy. I think it's also difficult because I feel like we also can't necessarily know that about someone until maybe they've passed on. It feels like once someone stopped producing work, from that moment on, we see if they're still remembered, because if their works are still being produced, they're still kind of in our public mindset. So it would be interesting in like 100 years to know who are the famous fantasy people we're reading today, and did they stick around? I also wonder though if advertising or money or estates comes into who is remembered. I'm not an expert on that, but it's just kind of something interesting to think about. Either way, thank you, Vaughn. I really liked your comment. The second thing a ton of you talked about that I totally missed in my video was this idea of emotional attachment and how it's very difficult to define emotional attachment, and that's why so much of how we feel about books is very subjective. Destined 192 says, I think what makes it such a difficult thing to nail down is because we read the stuff we do because of the emotional value we get out of it. While it's not strictly necessary that one needs to be skilled to create an emotional reaction out of something we read, like something that becomes popular for its shocking content, for example, unskilled writing detracts from achieving the emotional value the author intended. The media that becomes popular in public opinion are the ones where many people got emotional value out of reading or watching it. So skilled authors are the ones where their writing creates little to no resistance to the ideas that they have presented and their intentions. But not everyone is looking for the same kinds of emotional value as others, hence why we resonate with some authors and not others. I think that's a great point. I love that ending line, like we're not all looking for the same emotional response out of our novels, which I think can create a divide. For example, not to beat this topic to death, but when I had that live for Best Served Cold and we kind of jokingly said, you know, do you prefer Abercrombie or Sanderson, even though we were kind of all fans of both, you know, two of us said Sanderson, two of us said Abercrombie, and after the live we were kind of discussing why, and it turned out we really were looking for different things from our books. We were looking to feel differently at the end of the novels, and I think that isn't right or wrong, it just is. So I think that's an interesting point that was brought up by Destin 1. Nathaniel also said something similar. He said, I think there's some room for objective analysis on prose and plot, but when it comes to characterization, all bets are off. You can't account for readers having an emotional attachment to or investment in the characters. Character can be boring and light on distinguishing features and still inspire a lot of identification on the part of the readers because of a character's experience is just so convincing, or characters can be very detailed and complex and not inspire much interest at all from readers. There's no way to get everyone on the same page with that metric. So again, you know, some people really vibe with a certain character that other people are like, nah, they were bland, they were boring. It all has to do with our past experiences. Additionally, Hunter commented that he thought emotional attachment should be one of our skill values that we assigned, like how emotionally attached people get to the work is something we should consider. And I think that's actually a cool skill to consider, even though it's probably the most subjective of any of the ones we came up with. Hunter says, fantasy books are first and foremost a type of narrative. The purpose of a narrative is something called emotional appeal. Emotional appeal is achieved through artistic merit, or in other words, something that communicates a universal truth that is ambiguous and open to interpretation. Books fail when they attempt to be otherwise. Books fail when rather than using narration to communicate elliptical knowledge, they attempt to communicate definitive knowledge. I really love this comment. It talks about something that I do want to actually talk about in another video, which is kind of the telling versus feeling storytelling. I do feel like I've read a lot of books recently that are hitting me over the head with their theme. They feel like you're not going to get it. And the problem is that, like Hunter says, it doesn't leave it open to interpretation, to ambiguity, to making the reader decide for themselves what to think. I do think in all sorts of narrative fiction, the idea that a book makes you think can be important, and it increases the likelihood that you will be emotionally attached. Either way, I really liked that comment, so thank you, Hunter. It can be really difficult to define what makes good emotional attachment or a good emotional appeal. Again, if we're all looking for different things, what's to say looking for one thing is better than looking for the other? Just all over though, emotional attachment, a very interesting topic. The next comment I really liked talked about sliders for our skill ratings. Because remember I asked the question like, how many of those skills do you have to be good in? How many of those do you have to hit? And I thought David said something really interesting. He said, in season 9 of the podcast Writing Excuses, Brandon Sanderson introduces a slider system for developing successful characters. He singles out 3 aspects of character building. 1, sympathy, 2, competence, and 3, proactivity. One aspect of this idea that stood out to me is that should a character lack or be low on the slider in one thing, sympathy let's say, as long as you've raised the slider on something else to compensate, you may still pull off a successfully engaging character. The example Sanderson et al. Point out is that Dr. House is highly competent and proactive, but not as sympathetic per se. I love this so much. The idea that we could apply sliders to those skill values. So, you know, we used Joe Abercrombie as an example. Like a lot of people talk about how his plot is lower on that, but he makes up for it so much with his character voice and his magic and his themes. And so I like this idea that like, okay, it's fine if one of our sliders is down. Okay, Sanderson's prose slider is down, but as long as their other sliders are up to the top to make up for it, then that can kind of show skill. We don't need to be skilled in all of them. Anyway, I thought that was a great point and I really liked it. The next thing a lot of people talked about is that we need to establish goals when we talk about what we're rating. I did like Greyco said that they think it's impossible to truly judge art subjectively. They think you can aim to judge it in an objective manner and generally should. The main issue that happens in those discussions, but one thing being better than another, seems to be a lack of establishing goals. One thing can only be better than another if the parameters that make it good or bad are defined. I thought this was a super interesting point, and to this effect, somebody commented, and I couldn't find their comment, I'm sorry, so if it was you, thank you. They brought up the Marvel movies, and they talked about how there's like always an argument, are the Marvel movies cinema? What was the Marvel movie setting out to do? Were they setting out to be art or were they setting out to be entertaining? And I think we all know they were setting out to be entertaining, and they obviously met that mark. We were all very entertained by Marvel for a long time. So if it met its goals, doesn't that mean something when we're talking about like objectively good or bad? And the parameters aren't that it's art, because it wasn't trying to be. So I thought that was like an interesting perspective about when we go into comparing books, instead of trying to be like best or better, good or bad, but like, what are our parameters? Are we talking about plot or character voice or emotional attachment? Like, I just thought that was a good point. I also really liked what Joanna had to say. If you haven't checked out her channel, do so, it's great. She said that she created a rating system based on characters, world, plot, but she found it was hard because how do you, for example, rate the plot aspect if the author didn't write a plot-driven book? Do I give The Blade itself a 2 in plot, thus bringing down the rating of the book overall that I loved simply because it didn't have a strong plot on purpose? So I really liked that. You know, Joanna made a super objective rating system and then found that it failed in a book she really loved because she couldn't rate it well on plot because it didn't have a ton, but she liked that it didn't. So again, I think this brings into like, sometimes what we like just cannot be pinned down. You know it when you see it, and there isn't always like a rhyme or reason to art. And that makes it just hard in the objectivity sector. Another point that Michael brought up that I wanted to talk about, I was super grateful he watched my video since he was one of the videos who inspired this one. But I really liked what he said. He said one of the reasons that he doesn't think categorizing, even specifically by genre, works is because it can severely miss innovative shifts or changes within a work. If something is very outside the lines in terms of its approach or goals, it may fall short on meeting the fantasy tent posts, for instance, but still find a large audience and dictate shifts in genre at large. If I were to look at objective standards that can potentially use to measure art, influence would be my other standard in addition to public perception. Influence and the way that art can inspire similar works of art or dictate future trends would be another measurable metric to some degree. I really loved this point about how when we try to overdefine our genre, it can lead us to excluding very important pieces of work as maybe not good or skilled that can show an important shift in the genre at large. I think that's such an interesting point. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the video I made about the non-respect for fantasy and how a lot of times bookstores or people will take books and put them in literary fiction when they're clearly fantasy because it's like they have this definition of what fantasy is. And I don't know if this has happened ever, but I just liked the idea of like, hey, if we try to overdefine this, we may be missing trends or beautiful things that don't make sense to us now, but will make sense later, which can also be a hallmark of great art. So I just thought that was really interesting. A lot of people also wanted to talk about just objectivity in general and how things are just so much more subjective than we think. Like, we may think things are more objective in the world. I really liked Chris Strutt said this. If the topic interests you, I recommend reading Philosophy of History by William Dray. There's a chapter on objectivity in history that teases out parts of what you went over in your video. For many reasons, some of which you mentioned, he concludes that historical works are always subjective. And I think many of his points relate to fictional storytelling as well. So I put this book on my list. I haven't read it yet, but I'm super interested, especially in reading the chapter on objectivity. But it does feel like weird to be like, history is subjective. It feels wrong. It feels like there's gotta be something in this world that's objective, and wouldn't history be objective? But of course, at least I grew up always hearing that history is written by the victors. And if history is written by the victors, that implies that history would be written differently by another perspective. And can we really say history is objective? No, like, I know it's not, but it feels like it should be. And if we can't even make history of true events that happened objective, how can we possibly bring so much objectivity into even just like reviewing works? I just really liked that. Uri Gott had a few things to say opposing that idea. He claimed that subjective review means that you are expressing your thoughts, experience, likes, and dislikes about the art piece, but an objective review describes the art piece for what it is, using definitions while disregarding thoughts, experiences, likes, and dislikes. A subjective review is unrefutable. No one can say your experience is wrong. Objective reviews can be wrong. If I describe a painting and say that it's a statue, I'm wrong because I'm misunderstanding their definitions. So to express an objective review, one needs to lay out definitions, categories, and see if the art piece matches that definitions or satisfies that criteria. For example, Allomancy's A Hard Magic System is an objective review then. Now, what we can do with that when we discuss authors and skill is have fun and productive debate. So he talks a lot about the definitions being correct, though he doesn't mention at the end, objective reviews don't have to be agreed upon with everyone. That's weird, but humanity can't even agree that the world is round, so like, WTF. I mean, he's not wrong. I actually disagree a little bit with this, which I'm allowed to say because Uri Gott is my friend and he knows I love him. But I think it's harder to disregard our feelings than he says. He says, objective review is you purposely disregarding personal feelings and likes and dislikes. And I think there's some part of that, like when I go into my SPFBO reviews and I'm getting a YA, I am trying to take my personal emotions out of it. So I'm like, was this romance written well, even if it is not a romance that appeals to me? So I think there is a way to separate that. And I've been trying to do that in my SPFBO reviews to be as fair to the books as possible, since I'm not necessarily choosing them, so I might get genres out of my way. However, I think sometimes we don't even know that we are letting our past and likes and dislikes influence us. And that's where it becomes impossible to be objective, even if we think we are and are trying to work on definitions. The last point a lot of people talked about was that it actually takes skill to be a good reviewer. And I think that's something that I've learned as well, just in my booktube journey. But I liked what people brought up about how the more they work on reviewing books, the less opaque their own biases become. They start realizing like, hey, I constantly don't like this this stuff and I constantly like this stuff. And that ability to view our biases can actually help us in being more objective. And it's something I've started to notice in myself as well. The more I practice reviewing, the more I realize what are my biases. And even if I cannot get rid of them, being able to at least state them helps. I did think these two comments were also interesting. Don Fulmer says that as a musician, he spends a lot of time increasing his skill, not necessarily so he can make better music, but so he can enlarge his toolbox so he has more ways to express himself. And he said it's helpful to think of a musician who are skilled and who other people are skilled, as listening to them can help me develop my musical tools. And Miss Bellatrissa talks about with photography, the photos she's most proud of, took the most effort, time, and skill to make, are very often not the ones other people in her environment like the most. So maybe reviewing something in a good way also takes some experience, knowledge, and skill. And she sees that on BookTube. I'm very fascinated by how objectively some booktubers review books. Before I discovered BookTube, I didn't even really know why or what I liked or disliked about books. Only after watching you guys articulate what you liked, I was able to slowly figure out what it was that I preferred. So I like both of these comments. I felt like they were pretty related. I like the idea of an author increasing skill. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are better or worse, but having more things in their toolbox leads them more likely to be liked. Did that make sense? I think I'm trying to go off of Dawn's music about how, yeah, just having more stuff in our toolbox doesn't mean I will make as good a pieces as everybody else, but it is a step in that direction. And then Miss Bellatrissa talked about what I basically said, like, hey, the more I look at other people's reviews, the more I realize can articulate better what I like and dislike. And I think that articulation can lead to maybe not objectivity, but to at least being transparent with the people around you in your reviews so that they understand why you may have the opinion that you do. And yes, how did you know? Is it coming out in my reviews that I drive people insane? Okay, jokes aside, thanks guys. This is everything I dreamed about in BookTube. I really want to have these discussions with you guys, and I love how thoughtful you guys are and how much research you do and how much you teach me about books and art and the world at large. I hope this was an interesting discussion. Please let me know below if you agreed with any of these comments, what you think it adds to the discussion, and what it means to be objective and subjective when we talk about liking books. As always, if you like these sort of videos, please like and subscribe. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, along with other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.